The Monkey's Paw. On a dark and stormy night, the White family sat cozily in their small parlor. Mr. White and his son Herbert were engaged in a game of chess, while Mrs. White knitted by the fire. The wind howled outside, making the night seem even more foreboding. As they played, Mr. White made a fatal mistake in the game, which Herbert quickly capitalized on. "Checkmate," Herbert said with a grin. Mr. White grumbled good-naturedly about the poor weather and their remote location, just as a visitor arrived. The visitor was Sergeant Major Morris, a friend of Mr. White's who had served in the British Army in India. He was a burly man with a ruddy complexion and a wealth of stories about his adventures abroad. After some pleasantries and a few glasses of whiskey, Morris began to tell the Whites about a strange and mystical object he had brought back from India, a monkey's paw. The paw, he explained, had been enchanted by an old fakir to grant 3 wishes to 3 different people. However, the wishes came with a terrible price, as the fakir wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives and those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. Intrigued and skeptical, Mr. White asked to see the paw. Morris reluctantly took it out of his pocket and handed it over. It was a small, shriveled paw, not much to look at, but it held a sinister power. Morris warned them of the consequences, recounting how the previous owner had used his 3rd wish to wish for death. Despite Morris's warnings, Mr. White was fascinated. He bought the paw from Morris for a small sum, and after some more conversation, Morris left, urging them to destroy the paw. But the Whites, curious and excited by the possibilities, decided to keep it. That night, after Herbert had gone to bed, Mr. White held the paw and made his first wish. He wished for £200 to pay off their mortgage. As he made the wish, the paw moved in his hand, startling him. Mrs. White laughed it off, but Mr. White felt a sense of unease. The next day, Herbert went to work at the local factory as usual. That afternoon, a man from the factory arrived at the Whites' home with terrible news. Herbert had been caught in the machinery and killed. The company, while not admitting liability, offered the Whites a compensation of £200. The Whites were devastated. Mrs. White was inconsolable, and Mr. White was racked with guilt and horror. The money they had wished for had come at the cost of their beloved son's life. Days passed in a blur of grief. One night, in her anguish, Mrs. White remembered the monkey's paw. She urged her husband to use the 2nd wish to bring Herbert back to life. Mr. White was horrified at the idea, fearing the consequences, but Mrs. White was desperate. Reluctantly, he took the paw and wished for Herbert to return. Hours passed, and nothing happened. They began to think the wish had failed. But then, in the dead of night, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. White, filled with hope, ran to open it, but Mr. White held her back, fearing what might be on the other side. The knocking grew louder and more insistent. In a panic, Mr. White grabbed the paw and made his 3rd and final wish. The knocking stopped abruptly. When Mrs. White finally opened the door, there was no one there. Herbert was gone, and the paw's power was spent. The story ends with the Whites left to mourn their son, having learned a terrible lesson about the dangers of tampering with fate. The end.